My father had us one Saturday and he took us to Central Park to the Conservatory Water, which is where, they have the iconic sort of photograph of the young boy carrying the large sailing ship. And it's where you can go even today and rent little motorized boats to sail on this very formal pond. And he took us there and he sat us down and he said, well, what do you think? We liked it. And he said, well, this didn't happen by accident. Somebody made this. And the idea that, to an 8-year-old that you could make nature, that to me was absolutely fascinating.
This is Inside the Apple Studio, the podcast that details the intersection of architecture and Apple and explores how architects and other design professionals use Apple products in the practice of architecture. With your host, architect Neil Pam. Support for Inside the Apple Studio comes from Monograph. Monograph is the cloud-based practice operations solution built for architects by architects. Learn how Monograph can help you be more productive at monograph.com. Inside the Apple Studio is also supported by Arc IT. Arc IT is an IT provider that specializes in serving Mac and PC-based architecture and design firms. For a free consultation, go to getarcit.com. Welcome to Inside the Apple Studio. I'm pleased to have someone who started and owns a mission-driven social justice practice that is known for innovative landscape preservation, development, and management. She is passionate about the protection and restoration of heritage trees and living landmarks and is a nationally recognized figure in the preservation of cultural heritage sites. I'm honored to have Elizabeth Kennedy to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for asking me, Neil. I'm really psyched to be here.
Great. Well, I appreciate it. Well, let's jump right in. And I want to start off with asking what inspired you to become a creative professional and a landscape architect?
Well, that's really sort of easy. I happen to be the daughter and the niece of architects. So this in a way has been the family business. But also, my parents met and married while my dad was an architecture student. And so things that might have been in an office were actually in our home. We had to be told not to use the magic markers, and my parents really encouraged the arts in the home. It was very important. There was always music on Saturdays. We drew on every available piece of paper, my brother and I. And I think in large part, as I get older, I realize that must have been, their sort of strategy for managing us, because we were pretty much engrossed in what we were doing.
Instead of sitting in front of the TV, it was sitting in front of a piece of paper and drawing.
And we would do this, and my father was very excited to share what he was learning with us. Both my parents worked during the day, and then my dad went to school at night. So we really, our family time was really weekends, and I remember, this year has been a lot of talking about how you got started. And my father had us one Saturday and he took us to Central Park to the Conservatory Water, which is where, they have the iconic sort of photograph of the young boy carrying the large sailing ship. And it's where you can go even today and rent little motorized boats to sail on this very formal pond. And he took us there and he sat us down and he said, well, what do you think? We liked it. And he said, well, this didn't happen by accident. Somebody made this. And the idea that, to an 8-year-old that you could make nature, that to me was absolutely fascinating. To the extent that I would dig up the backyard And
Wow.
we had a failed backyard. The entire backyard was shaded by a large maple. And so, my mother was like, I'm not doing this. So, my father had projects and stuff was in the garage and they were out during the week. So you could come home and decide that you were going to make a river and, dig a small trench and fill it with water and then, float a popsicle stick down and all of these things. And, that started very early. So that sort of influence was always there. I always drew, I always painted. My parents, I didn't do music classes, I did art classes. And when my family moved to Jamaica, things changed. When my father finished and actually the family moved to Jamaica and he joined my uncle's architecture firm. My uncle, they weren't related, they were in-laws.
Okay.
But my father joined that firm. And the life that we had in New York was sort of put aside. But if you go to school in the British education system, particularly at that time, which was the late 60s, early 70s, you kind of have to choose your life early. At 14, they ask you, what do you want to do? And I said, I had just read an article on one of my father's architectural records, and I was thumbing through it, and there was this thing called, they had a landscape architect on the project. And I thought, oh, this really captures everything that I was interested in, because I've been interested in rocks as a kid and, marine biology, and I thought I would be a farmer, and I love to draw. So here was this profession. And I have to say that, like, my high school headmistress, very, it was like Harry Potter on steroids. She went out of her way to make sure that I had the preparatory classes in high school to be able to pursue this profession, since I was 14. So I was one of the few girls, I went to an all-girls school, and who did both arts and sciences.
Interesting.
And they had to configure the schedule around me being able to move between these two areas of discipline. Because in the British system, if you say you want to study physics, that's all you study. You don't do other electives. You do physics, right?
Okay.
And so we were sort of oriented or geared towards that system. But I was coming back to the United States. I was an American citizen, first generation immigrant. And, the education system here was always broader.
Yeah.
So I was, but I had chemistry, and I had biology, and I had art, and I had to do a language. So I had a lot of French. There were all of these things that we had to do, but there was a special effort made for me to be able to do this. And I'm always grateful. Interestingly, I mean, I didn't target a landscape architecture program as an undergrad. I had researched, and I knew that you could go to a master's program, you could attend a master's program and do the 3 years, which in the 70s was kind of revolutionary. I'm dating myself, but I don't care.
That's okay.
And so I wanted to take my undergraduate studies as an opportunity to just do something I would never do otherwise. Mm-hmm. And I ended up at Cornell, and was in the College of Human Ecology, and I was in the Department of Design and Environmental Analysis. And I focused on the environmental analysis part with the concentration in housing. The Department of Public Policy had a different name at that time, but I had a concentration in housing. And, that sort of gave me a foundation to look at things very broadly and very differently. I certainly had a greater exposure to a wider range of things at Cornell than I would have definitely if I'd stayed within a British system. And I stayed at Cornell to do graduate studies in landscape architecture. So,
Why Cornell?
well, first of all, at that time, there was a lot more scholarship money, and Cornell was very generous. I did my part. I kept my grades up, but they were very generous. I had applied to 4 schools at the time. Cornell, University of Pennsylvania, Berkeley, and Harvard. And Penn, Cornell, and Berkeley accepted me right out and were generous. Mm-hmm. And Harvard was like, well, let's wait and see.
Their loss.
Well, they actually wrote me back and said, you're in. But I was young and I'd already committed to Cornell at that time.
Yeah.
Because first of all, I thought I was going to go back to Jamaica to live and practice. And at that time you could own, foreign exchange was very highly regulated, and you could only export or take $50 out of the country per year. And I just thought I could never saddle myself with any sort of debt or anything else like that would prevent me from being able to make these obligations one way or the other. And so, financial support was very critical, and Cornell was the most generous, and Harvard was just a crapshoot. And I was telling somebody recently that I never told my parents that I'd gotten into Harvard. And I realized, of course, that my father would have killed himself to make sure that would have happened. So I kind of spared them that, but it was, you're 21, you think you know everything. But I don't regret staying at Cornell for a second. It was a great education. It was a great school, great university to be part of. And I hope I've done as well for the university as it did for me.
Yeah. Speaking of the university at Cornell, was there a class or a professor there that had an influence on you and your career path?
A lot of it all, they all came about and they all touched down in different ways. Let me put it that way. In terms of my undergraduate major, I was interested in how psychology would influence issues of psychology influenced the built environment and the responsibility of the designer. And there was I forget which instructor had us begin to explore lateral thinking and the work of Edward de Bono. And I was, you're an undergraduate, so you start reading a lot of Paulo Freire and, a lot of philosophical things because that's what you do. So there was this sort of idea that, I was coming from a Caribbean country that was emerging from colonialism. And so examining how it would define itself and move forward. The 70s was a very sort of important creative time in the Caribbean and in Jamaica. I mean, this is when Bob Marley sort of emerged as an international star, and it wasn't just Bob, but all of these things were happening. Michael Manley, for better or for worse, I'm not going to take a stand.
Okay.
Michael Manley, but was saying that we had to define ourselves. We were an independent country, and so to go to university and read Latin American, in particular, philosophers around again emergent, the ethos of the self and the responsibility of the person and sort of like being in the world, these questions of being in the world, where, that was sort of like a subtext to things I was looking at Cornell. And then you'd get a professor who would say, okay, this is our curriculum, this is what we're going to read. And coming from a place like Jamaica where everything is so highly structured, you survive by coloring within the lines, right? And then you come to the university here, and somebody is telling you to look at things in different ways, and sort of training yourself to be able to do that was really very gratifying. But I remember, having gone through the undergraduate curriculum in DEA and ending up the course that was taught by Gary Coates, who was an architect. And Gary, I remember sitting in the class and he said, listen, you can't predict how people are going to respond to anything. And I was like, whoa. So what were the last 3 years about? But it was a fascinating sort of understanding of, or sort of door opening about what could be considered in terms of design. And then, moving on to graduate school, we had a very small faculty at the time. We had a very small program, and each faculty member at the time had a sort of personality or a quirk that you could sort of think, oh, that's kind of interesting. Our history professor at the time, Lenny Mirren, there was extraordinary deep dives into the history of landscape architecture. I was talking to a group from Cornell last night, and somebody said that they didn't feel that their history was represented. And I understand that there was no attention paid to any sort of non-European, non-Asian sort of architectural expression or land use, sort of patterning that way. But I felt that you could take the language that you were being, in its most abstract form, that you were being sort of trained in, and look for the patterns that you needed to see elsewhere. Since in the 40 plus years since I was in school, there's been a tremendous level of scholarship that's just opened up a real world of available information. And it means that you have to just have the time to sit and sort of delve,
Yeah.
but there's opportunity there, and it's exciting. But Lenny with his history, Tom Johnson, who was a very sort of cool, laid back guy. He was the one who probably tried to impart the greatest sense of party and organization. That this is what you kind of look for in design. Peter Trowbridge, who just retired from the program like maybe a year or two ago, might be 3. Past 18 months have just been lost. Peter really explained the balance that you had to have between a strong idea and strong technical capabilities. And Marvin Edelman, who was also an extraordinary educator, was very much about this. This has to be real. It has to be buildable. It has to be, you could talk all you want about the idea, but it's got to get off the paper and onto and into the ground. So, and those were the big 4 that I can remember, and then Arthur Lieberman, who was a faculty member more involved in the environmental questions. He was back and forth from Israel, but I took a class with him, and he was he was the type of guy that you went and sat in seminar and talked with, and he was very broad in his interests. So you could go to him about things that weren't necessarily design studio related, but it had to do with land use. It had to do with cultural. And I think maybe Art was the first person that I could have a conversation about cultural interpretation of land use and have it taken seriously as a conversation.
Yeah.
So that was Cornell.
Wow, what an awesome experience. Now, before you went on to found your own landscape architecture practice, you had a few different experiences working for landscape architect and for affordable housing developing company.
Mhm.
What did you learn while working for the landscape architect, and how did that lead to you working for an actual housing developer at some point?
It was kind of funny because I think your first job is when you realize that working is not like school, right? That there's it's so, and that was very much the case. The first person I worked for, and I give this example all the time, but I'm not sure that people think it's important. I left school during a recession.
Mhm.
And let me be really candid. I also left without finishing my thesis. I was writing the same 5 sentences over and over and over again, and couldn't figure out a way of moving forward with the topic. Uh, I, I, 40 years later, I kind of understand where things kind of went sideways, but at the time it was a little abstract to me. But I had to get a job, and I came out, and I remember coming into interview with a woman who had a small firm, and her name was Lois Scher, and she had a deadline. And she said, "Oh, well, your work looks nice." And she said, "Do you mind helping out?" I said, "Sure." And I worked there until 11 o'clock that night, helping them get
Oh
get their
my.
work done.
Yeah,
And she hired me right away.
I'd hope so.
Yeah,
After that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And she's been a tremendous influence in my life. She's been a friend all this time. Um, on occasion, a surrogate mom.
Mhm.
And um, but I always like to say that Lois set the standard. Uh, when you're an employer, you're giving people a chance a lot of
Mhm.
times, and she set that example, that she gave me a chance to get started. And she was doing high-end residential and actually building a lot off of schematics, which kind of was surprising to me. She also had work with New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, and so I did the playgrounds. I sort of liked to draw them. I kind of liked figuring them out, and and it sort of gave me confidence in getting a grasp around construction documentation. I worked with her until she started to she always had a lifelong interest in beads. I want to make sure everybody understands the BEADS, because a lot of people hear bees, but it's beads. And she focused on that, and she's written a number of best-selling bead books.
Wow.
So
Okay.
she changed the focus of her life and towards that, and the practice closed. And I worked for a lot of small firms, largely as a freelancer for a long time.
Mhm.
And uh, my mother grew more concerned, and at one point she said, "You need to go and get a job at McDonald's." This is nothing like your mother, telling you, come on now, that, and McDonald's. If I had done that, I would have been doing better financially than I was at the time. But uh, I then went to work in a design build department in a nursery, and that was very much a sales job. And I had no experience in sales. Um, I didn't know how to sell. I didn't know what was involved in selling. I didn't really have, I didn't understand it. And I have to say, at that time, I didn't respect it. And I've since learned to, but at that time I didn't. And so that job didn't last that long. But in the 6 months I was there, because it was design build, I learned to run a construction crew, and I learned to handle plant materials. That sort of made things things were no longer abstract once I did that. I came back to work. I worked again for Lois for a short period of time, and I worked for another good friend, Mary Myers, and I worked for Deborah Nevins for a period of time, sort of applying what I'd learned in that short construction stint. And then I was back freelancing again. My mother was getting concerned again, and a friend called up and she said, "Listen, I know this head of a small development company. They do affordable housing, and they're looking for a project manager." And so I went to work with them for 2 years. And prior to that, in the course of the freelancing, I'd taken a class called the Workshop in Business Opportunities. And anybody who knows me, I mean, like anybody, like the bus driver, anybody who knows me knows that, I advocate heavily that people should take the Workshop in Business Opportunities. And in fact, it's something that I require my staff to do. And it remains a 16-week course in how to start and profitably run a business. You do marketing, you do sales, you do costing, you do pricing, you do cash flow, you do all of these things. And when I went to work for that developer, I brought Weibo in with me. Mm-hmm. And I heard through the grapevine that I was the only one who was profitably running projects in the company. But they had larger issues. So by that time, I was also, I had accumulated enough experience through the freelancing, through stints in teaching, through all these other things to qualify in New York State to take the license. And so I became licensed during that time. And when that company decided to reorganize, went bankrupt, I then started the firm.
So you've been running your own landscape architecture firm for over 25 years now. Why did you start the firm when you had the chance, and what lessons have you learned during that time about running a successful business?
Well, I thought, as I mentioned, the construction company I worked with had folded and reorganized, and I thought this was during that time when I was learning affordable housing. I was in the deep end of the pool, and I had to learn financing, real estate development, how to put together a pro forma, how to analyze again the cash flow in a project, how to manage costs. That sort of gave me the real foundation to know that, okay, I really had a better understanding about what was going on. I know a lot of people open their doors and they're focused on the design and they're not focused on the other parts of the business. And if they don't have this sort of understanding and they sort of succeed, I'm very convinced that they succeeded because they were lucky. And what I mean by lucky is that they had such a profit margin that they could survive all kinds of mistakes. What I saw during the affordable housing development process was that there were very few decisions that were being made about what we now call quality of life. Like there was no consideration to open space. There was no consideration to front or rear yard development, streetscapes, connection, urban design. None of that went into the thinking, and at least at that time. And because of my training, I could see that it was absent. So I felt as though I was in a position to influence the dialogue around this. I don't know why I particularly thought that, but that's what I did. I started the very first project that I had was a small contract, a very small contract to write a scope of work to I guess, develop and support a series of community gardens in Northwest Harlem, identify sites and see what they could do. And this is ridiculous. There needs to be a bigger understanding of open space in all of its forms within densely occupied communities that suffer high rates of asthma, et cetera, so that people could better advocate at the city level for the quality of their urban environment. When I think now, that was sort of a very sort of naive. I mean, you could only be somebody whose mother is saying you need to work at McDonald's to start your firm with that, without really thinking, that this was the express statement in the RFP. But it became sort of a clarion call. The project was picked up by the City College Architectural Center, and it became a day-long symposium at Harvard GSD about environmental justice. And I was reminded about its importance the other day in a discussion. I didn't start out with that ambition. I just wanted to make sure that, quite frankly, that there was an opportunity to do good work. And so sometimes you have to advocate for that in order to make sure it happens. And that's how I started. And then even though I'd done WeBo, without a real marketing plan or anything, I'd started doing high-end residential, things where people who knew me but were too busy to take on certain projects, called Elizabeth. I did that, and then two things happened. Somebody said, "Are you registered with the city as a minority or woman-owned business?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Oh, no, I'll do that for you." And it's like in the movies, you're standing there and somebody sort of kind of whisks you along, and suddenly you're in this process. So that's how I got certified, and that's what started, I would say, my journey in public sector work. And we started working on psychiatric facilities, making them, among other things, more secure, more the interface with the community to be a little gentler, to make sure that there was sufficient open space of a certain quality that could enhance a therapeutic environment. That's where we started. And then it's been kind of an unplanned climb since then.
Yeah.
But what then happened was that we stumbled into, and I want to put that way, into doing cultural resource work.
Mm-hmm.
And then things got interesting. I'll put it that way. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you if you can take a minute to talk about what it means to have a mission-driven and social justice practice. What does that mean to you and your firm and what you do?
It's it is not difficult to have a mission-driven firm if you work in the public sector, if you do civic work, and if you understand the importance of the work to the civic realm. So sometimes the work isn't glamorous. We've done our share of restoring electrical conduit trenches, trust me. But this is all important work. I mean, this is how the city and the state and the region, country runs. So in that sense, it's not something unusual. Where things became definitive for us in this area is that, and it's a podcast, so I'm not sure that people understand that I'm a woman of African descent. And so companies would, usually larger projects are bundled under a prime contract, and an architecture firm or an engineering firm is leading it. And in several instances, architecture firms came to me to ask me to participate on these projects for the sole reason that that I head a firm. I'm the head of a firm, and I happen to be a woman of African descent.
Mm-hmm.
And so those projects were in African American communities. And so making sure that those communities could make sure that their stories were properly told and making sure that their interests were represented, we took that responsibility very seriously. Not because we, sort of know the secret handshake, but because we did what we're supposed to do, which is listen really carefully. And I give this as an anecdote because we've done projects that have national significance. We're known for the work at the Weeksville Heritage Center, and Weeksville remains probably my best loved project. It's not my only child, but it's always been special to me and the firm. But even when we worked at Harlem Stage, and the idea of the history of that structure and how it changed over time, and how the gatehouses were important in the city because I guess the Department of Public Works at the time would open them to the public so that the public could see the miracle of engineering. You could visit a gatehouse on a Sunday and see water flowing through the chambers, and how now it's dance performance space. How that narrative gets told, through the landscape and just through its sort of treating it with a certain respect has been a large part of what we do. And the fact that these facilities, these amenities are located in communities that don't often get a lot of love has also been really important. So you advocate for a proper budget, and you want to make sure that things are finished with, so that they're resilient, things like that. So it's not as exotic as it sounds. But I remember once we were working on a project in the Lower East Side, which is New York City's Chinatown, and one of the community sponsors came and they said, "Would you help us with another project?" And I declined because I didn't feel that I had a sufficient grasp on the cultural issues. Mm-hmm. But I realized, 15 or 20 years later, that there had to have been something that I was saying in the meetings that made them feel that they could come and ask me to be part of this other initiative that they had. And subsequently, we worked with the Hebrew Free Burial Association on the initial aspects of restoring the Silver Lake Cemetery. And this cemetery had been formed specifically to give religious burial to members of the Eastern European immigrant community who had become estranged from that community and were not afforded the ordinary services within a land. They couldn't afford to. They were ostracized, or they were couldn't afford to be members of Landsmannschaft, which was like this. These predated all of the social support, social net, safety net things that we have in place today. That story was fascinating to me, but it was my administrative assistant at the time who delved down and understood what the actual issue was in this alienation. And we were able to point out to the client how unique that was. And that uniqueness was the thing that underpinned the application to the National Register of Historic Places for that. So it's sort of like this collective effort. It goes to having a perspective and I think an interest in the things that drive a culture or a community or in their understanding of the world, their worldview, to understand it, to be able to sort of latch on to the physical aspects of those and how those things are represented or preserved, and making sure that your staff also understands this, so that even your, the person who answers the phone could say, wait a minute, this is the interesting thing here, and have everybody else say, you're right. Yeah.
Now, you've mentioned previously working on public works projects and working for public clients. Mm-hmm. In your experience, what's it like to work for a public client, and how has that been different from your experience working for private clients?
For those of your listeners who don't know anything about the public sector, I need to explain that the government agencies, they don't pay retainers. There is no upfront money. And you can go for very, very long periods of time before you receive compensation. So that requires a very specific kind of business strategy, and I think an existential decision that you're going to be in this area of work. The projects are for the public good. School playgrounds, if you're doing that, parks, if you're doing that, museums, if you're doing that, historic sites, if you're doing that, roadways, if you're doing that. Landscape architects are very, very involved in issues of resilience, coastal, upland, stormwater runoff management. These are all huge drivers in the industry right now. And all of that has to do with an understanding of the public good. Now, the question, who is the public? How broad is the public? How narrow is the public? And how is the public segmented, if it is? Those are also questions. But the issue with public work is that you are doing things for the public good. So you get to collaborate on generally the work that involves landscape architecture in the public sector. The projects tend to be bigger. The fees, the construction budgets can be in the millions of dollars, which a lot of people don't necessarily realize that landscape architects work there. So the fees, you have this terrible cash flow, but the fees can be better.
Okay.
You have to. A lot of times the need to be absolutely current in technology and to be able to flexibly adapt to new technology is very much a factor of doing business. I think if you're doing private sector work, the client has no interest whatsoever in how you're producing the technical information, the drawings and specs. But the government, sometimes they tell you the software that you have to use. They tell you the format in which documents have to be delivered. They set all of these standards and regulations as part of doing business with them. Because the projects are larger and because you generally have, but not always, an architect or an engineer running the project. Whoever's running the project is also setting the technological demands. And so we are amongst the few landscape architects who do work in Revit. Mm-hmm. It's painful. There's other BIM software that's a lot more suited to landscape architects, but our need to be able to quickly communicate and collaborate means that we have to go into that area of software, and you have to make sure that your entire sort of financial structure can support all of this. In private sector, it's different. It's the relationships can be a lot more intimate. You're dealing with people's homes. You're dealing with people's taste. You're dealing with things that you're really sort of drawing and feeding off of the client to do. But the essentials are still there. How the client is looking at the world, what the client aspires in hiring you or your firm. that doesn't change whether or not it's an individual or a small family or a large family or a community. You have to be able to glean that information to meet those needs.
Well, Elizabeth, I want to thank you for talking about all these different experience and this passion for what you do and the importance of what you do. It's really inspiring. And we're going to just take a short break. And after, we'll explore more about your experience with the Mac and other Apple products right after this. Architects, how do you manage your firm? Are you using dated and clunky software? Are you frustrated using different spreadsheets and never really getting a clear view of the status of your projects? Then let me tell you about Monograph, because they can help. Monograph is online software that is designed by architects for architects. It allows you to track your time, your projects, and your budgets. It can not only track all of this, but it can do it all in real time. Monograph has an awesome tool called Money Gantt. With it, you can immediately see whether you are under or over budget on a project. Monograph also comes with a tool called Resource, which allows you to reallocate your team's time and track its impact on your remaining budget. Using this powerful tool, you can easily adjust your projects on a week-to-week basis. Can your dated and clunky software do that? Monograph makes this easy. Check out all the ways Monograph can help your firm be more productive at monograph.com and be proactive with Monograph. As business owners and architects, how often do we think about our IT provider? Typically, only when things go wrong. For many of us, unfortunately, this happens too often, especially with the latest emphasis on remote work. I know I've had to deal with my fair share of IT fire drills. It's not a pleasant experience, and clearly I wasn't dealing with an IT provider like ArcIT. ArcIT is a different kind of company. They specialize in serving Mac and PC-based architecture and design firms. This means they understand your Mac-related challenges of keeping your personal and your business data separate and have experience providing solutions when certain software providers stop supporting Mac OS. Combine this with industry-leading response times, proactive remote hardware management, solid disaster recovery and backup solutions, and enterprise-grade security management. And yet, all of the above are just table stakes for a solid IT company. ArcIT goes a step further. They become your strategic partner when it comes to planning, budgeting, and integrating new technology into your business. All of this sounds expensive, right? Not with ArcIT. Because ArcIT is highly specialized for our industry, their pricing is on par, or in some cases even lower, than other IT providers. ArcIT is transparent and publishes its pricing on its website. Your business deserves a competent, responsive, and proactive IT partner. Reach out to Boris, ArcIT's founder and CEO, for a free consultation. Go to getarcit.com and click Work with Us. Welcome back, everyone. Elizabeth, you've shared an incredible journey of your professional career. Now let's discuss how you got started using a Mac and other Apple products. How were you first exposed to the Mac, and what was the first Mac that you used?
The first Mac that I used was the first one that I bought. I had to look up what actually it was. It was a Macintosh Plus. It was one of the little 9-inch screens. It was still black and white. It whirred when you turned it on. And I think it had 1 megabyte of memory. I was reading recently. So I still have it in a closet because I keep most things for some reason. But that was what I started with. And that really was entirely personal use. As I started the business, I started the business with a typewriter and drafting by hand. So we weren't even using the computer in that way.
Yeah.
I probably started to use the Mac in the office in earnest when I actually also had to bring PCs in at first, because Autodesk had stopped writing AutoCAD for the Mac by that time, and my clients, I was already moving into public sector work, and my clients were not using MiniCAD, which is now Vectorworks, or any of the other sort of Mac friendly software. So we had to have PCs in the office and systems that would support those networks. And then, but I always had a Mac. So like the office would have their, everybody else would have their desktops, and I would have my laptop or my desktop. And then as we had a couple of large projects sort of halfway in where we could bring in graphic designers and illustrators. And so they would work on Macs. We would sort of, bring in, and I always invested until recently in some of the lower end Macs. So I always had like an iMac, or I always had, one time we had an eMac, right? Things like this. So that there was this sort of administrative half of the office, and then the CAD aspect of the office. And then when Apple started to use the Intel chips, and at the same time Autodesk returned to writing Mac software, then I stopped using PCs. But over time, I was never really enthralled with their performance. We had to invest in weekly network maintenance. We were set up on a server in such a way, and we had a server crash, and that was a major setback in terms of data recovery. All of the things that we were supposed to be doing, that placed a certain burden on me that I just knew using Macs that we didn't have to do.
Yeah.
So I, and this coincided with the staffing going up and down. So I could bring Macs back into the office slowly. Where we really sort of changed things was when Apple introduced the iMac Pro.
Okay.
Because I knew that we would have enough firepower, right, to get what we had to get done. But I could have the sort of efficiency of the single unit and the all-in-one, and reduce the number of cables from 50 to 1. What is all this clutter? So we have a staff of 8, mm-hmm. and all of the computers in the office are Mac. We have 2 administrative stations, my laptop, 4 iMac Pros, mm-hmm. 2 27-inch, but these are i5s and not i7s. And so they're fine for some stuff, but not for others. Where we're sort of, we sort of did a workaround, and I think this is when I attracted your attention, is that we had to bring Revit into the office. Yeah. And we had to be able to collaborate in a certain way. And I knew with the Intel Macs that we could do boot camp and we could go back and forth. But I wasn't fully committed to that as a system. And in scouring the internet, we found that we could do an external drive, that Windows 10 can be operated off of an external drive. And so we have we have 4 external drives formatted with Windows 10, and each has a subscription copy of Revit on it. So it actually kind of makes it hot swappable. It's sort of interesting in that way. And for the level of Revit modeling that we have to do, it's been okay. People who really use Revit, they complain about the speed. Yeah. And somebody said, Liz, you might have to bite the bullet and partition a drive, and then so that we can go back and forth. I haven't committed to that yet because, again, it's everything. You have to do things in inches and increments, right? But it may be that we might have to bring into Windows laptops. I'm not sure yet. I'm not fully convinced, but it just seems that we would just have a little bit more speed and utility to this. One of the challenges I have is that you organize a Mac office differently than a PC office. And for me, the simplicity, the sort of elegant simplicity of the Mac system is really important. I don't like to spend a lot of time on technology. I don't like to spend a lot of time trying to figure things out. And to be honest with you, as I get older, I want to do this even less and less. So the ability for the sort of Mac ecosystem to have all the devices talking to each other and instant messaging going on a regular basis and all these other things that I didn't set out to exploit, but they're there,
Right.
They're part of the package. That has really meant that we can have a relatively simple digital operation in the office. Most of the staff that goes between the two, they actually like using the Mac better. They just find it simpler, and that makes life a lot easier for me. A number of people also have Macs personally, so they just kind of understand how to navigate it. Whereas the PC addicts, what do I do next? What do I do next?
Right.
And to be honest with you, when I have to go into the Windows 10 format to figure out everything, okay, can somebody come over here and tell me because it's not even doesn't even look the way it did when I was when we were using PCs 15 years ago. So there's a lot that has changed. I'm holding my breath because I know that Mac is moving away from the Intel chip towards the silicon chip, and I don't think for what we've been able to do that Parallels has been the best solution for us. And so part of me is thinking, well, how much of a footprint is Revit actually going to have in the office, and what do I have to expect to do that? My greatest hope is that I'm not sure why Autodesk is not really, or Apple are not sort of recognizing the AEC industry, because construction is one of the major drivers of the economy, right? So it's not as though there isn't a market there. But right now, with the workaround, we have a PC environment when we need to, but almost everything else is being done in the Mac.
So other than Revit, you mentioned AutoCAD. Are you still using AutoCAD for the Mac then?
Yeah, I prefer that the work is done in the Mac environment.
Yeah.
And whenever we've had to go back and forth and sort of test it, we've had costly errors. So it just means that I can control the workflow a bit more intuitively. It's just like things sort of fall into place using a Mac system in a way that you have to sort of be more disciplined in structuring it in a PC system.
What other applications or services do you use to manage your practice, like say for time tracking or accounting, project management?
Okay. We're a QuickBooks desktop firm, so that's one of the other softwares that I have to boot into the Windows environment to do. We are increasingly using iPads to do Bluebeam communication and Morpholio Trace to just be able to digitize sketching and communication on that level really fast.
Uh-huh.
So that works very well. They have the remote working for the pandemic sort of pushed this forward in the office, and then we brought certain aspects of those habits back when we regrouped. And so this sort of graphic communication on that level is important. We use the Adobe Creative Cloud software. Most of our software, first of all, now is cloud subscription based. So we use Rhino, we use SketchUp, we use Adobe Creative Cloud. Revit is BIM, is generally our projects. We prefer that our projects are in like BIM 360 or whatever the new collaboration is. But we can access the sort of shared work environment. I don't do it, so you're hearing me sort of be vague here, but the project managers involved in some of those projects, they're using their Macs, but they're accessing and downloading the information that they need in order to do it on the Mac desktop. We're not a GIS office, so we don't necessarily require GIS software. My understanding is that there's more utility again in the PC, but since we don't do it. So the workaround for us works pretty well. We use maybe 5 or 6, and of course, Microsoft Office suite.
Do you have some sort of shared calendar that you guys everyone on the team uses? And what is that?
We use the calendar that comes on the Mac.
Okay.
Everybody has an iCloud. Everybody has an iCloud account here, and so once they do, they just share their calendars, and everybody can see where everybody else is.
Okay, that makes sense. So, what's your favorite thing about using a Mac and other Apple devices?
For me, there's just a simplicity of use. It's just a real sort of direct simplicity. People talk about the elegance of the Mac design, and that's a little lost on me. I think it's a better looking product than the competition, but I'm not gazing at it the way I would look at a car. That's not on the radar for me. I like its efficiency. I really think that the products pack a lot of power into relatively small footprints. So even when we've used the lower grade Macs, we've been able to get an extraordinary amount done for an extended period of time. I mean, all of my Macs they last 7, 8, 9 years, and I haven't had the same success with the PCs that we've had.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's just the simplicity, the way the information is organized, the way it can be organized relatively intuitively, and our workflows make sense to anybody who sort of that's very important, because small firms don't necessarily. One of the differences between a small and a mid-size, and definitely a large firm, is that small firms don't necessarily have that middle in terms of management, in terms of, and sometimes it's people breathing thin air, and then a lot of entry level students, right? And so you need to have a sort of workflow and process management that people can get and get pretty simply. One of the reasons that I've insisted on using a Mac Office is, besides the fact that the IT demands are really sort of basic, the junior staff can't get into a lot of trouble. I used to say that, there's and my staff always said you use this phrase too much, but there's a point where the tail wags the dog until the dog starts to wag the tail. The amount of time spent with the tail wagging the dog, and it's sort of like, well, I don't know, I don't know how to. This can't be done because I don't know how to use the software to do it. It's like, listen, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, you could do this with a pencil and paper. So, we're going to figure out. So they, so it's accessible to the older staff like me, who is like, whoa, and the kids who they don't get caught up in what I call gaming. They're not sort of in the digital space to such a degree that we can't get things done. And so in terms of onboarding, training, teaching, getting people to master the tools, the computers just seem to work a lot better in a Mac environment to do that. And it's been important for us. Yeah.
What advice would you give the listeners if they're considering using a Mac to practice landscape architecture?
If you are doing work in AutoCAD, in particular AutoCAD LT, it's a no-brainer. It's a very speedy, efficient, comfortable way. Desktop environment. The screen is comfortable. The ergonomics really work very well, and working with the server systems, the archiving and the management and the connectivity in that sense is it's very efficient and it's not expensive. So those things all work in your favor. There's nothing that except maybe certain aspects of software that's not written for the Mac platform. There's nothing that you would do on a PC platform that you can't do in a Mac environment.
Yeah.
And so, and to do it simply.
Well, Elizabeth, I appreciate you sharing all of your Apple and Mac experience. But before we wrap this portion up, I want you to share with the audience one app or utility or service that you find most useful.
I love that between the iPad and the desktop, I can find a $10 application in the App Store that allows us to mess around in a way that's sort of quick and can be translated across the entire team and internally very easily. I really, so Morpholio Trace, for instance, is a really great find. I use it in a very basic kind of sloppy way, but there are people it's like, Liz, we can draw straight lines, I'm like, great, you do that. I'm gonna stay over here. So there, and so the same thing with the Bluebeam. Same thing, for a firm that's sort of running on fumes because of the way we do business, that utility makes it very, very easy and comfortable for us.
Yeah.
I think we found more flexibility, even though it's more expensive, more flexibility in subscribing to software. We can engage and disengage licenses much more easily, and the interface is smooth, it's quick, and again, it's very flexible. I don't have a favorite. I don't have a favorite. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I prefer social media on my phone. I have an iPhone 8, and we're thinking. I'm thinking about upgrading to an iPhone 13 Pro because of the LiDAR.
Yeah.
We're doing some projects that will allow us to additionally document existing conditions and things like that I think the LiDAR would allow us to do very quickly. And because we are working more and more in a 3D sort of just general interface, it'll allow us to bring that process on a lot faster. Yeah, the phone was a revelation. And that's a lot of fun. Yeah, so yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that. Well, next up is our 10 questions. And the first question is, what is your favorite word?
Mom.
What's your least favorite word?
Can't.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
I love wide open spaces. I absolutely feel connected to so many things in them.
What turns you off?
Bigotry.
What sound or noise do you love?
I love the sound of the city at 6:00 in the morning. Wherever it is that you are, when the city is waking up at 6:00, it's really great.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Metal scraping against concrete. It remains disturbing.
I thought you might say the beeping of a car backing up, as we heard a couple of times.
No.
What's your favorite curse word?
Oh, the F word. The F word. I've been asked to stop using the F word.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I would have liked to have been a vegetable farmer. Yeah. Or a marine biologist or an archaeologist. Yeah.
What profession would you not like to do?
I have enormous respect for people who care for the infirm. And it's not something I could do. Enormous respect for people, caregivers who see people at their worst and show up every day.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
There you are.
Well, that's great. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Inside the Apple Studio. Please let the listeners know where they can find you online and the best way to contact you.
The firm's website is eklastudio.com. We have a contact button there, and we monitor our info account, and we will love to get back in touch with anybody who is inquiring about landscape architecture as a profession or coursework. That would be good. Yes. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Elizabeth. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Inside the Apple Studio. I'd like to thank Monograph and ARC IT for their support. You can also support the show by telling a friend and show them how to follow it in their favorite podcast player. If you have comments on the show, you can find me on Twitter at NPANN or at Apple for Arc. That's Apple, FORARCH. You can also comment on the Apple for Architects Facebook page and join the Apple for Architects Facebook group. Inside the Apple Studio is a production of Apple for Architects at appleforarchitects.com.